I thought some of you might like a bookseller's viewpoint on this book. I hadn't heard of the book in spring of '03, and I got a phone call from my favorite editor, Cindy Spiegel, who works for Riverhead Publisher, which is Putnam and Viking, and she called me up and asked for a favor. And very seldom does a editor call you up and ask for a favor. So I got very excited, and she's been a favorite editor of mine for years and has edited many of my favorite authors. So I was certainly glad it was her. And she says, I have a book that I can't get going. It's a book that, and she began describing it roughly as our hostess here described it, and I said, well, it's the old boy best friends from different class situations. Is that I said, that doesn't sound like a particularly original theme. And she said, trust me on this one. And so I said, well, send me a book. And she said, well, all I have is a manuscript. So she sent me a manuscript. And I started reading it, and I read the book all night. And I said, well, can you get this person here? I called her up the next day and said, can you get this person here? And they said, well, we can only get them here on a Saturday. And I said, well, it'll be hard to publicize, but we'll try. And so she got him here, and we had a very small crowd, and we didn't have any radio. But what we did have, who we did have in the audience, was Dorothy Paul. And Dorothy Paul is a force to be reckoned with. And if Dorothy Paul likes your book, and if Dorothy Paul wants to do something for you, you've got a really good advocate. I think Chivy Sock was there, wasn't she, Dorothy? And you were there for that.
I was there.
And you were there. It was so we had some really high-powered human rights people there at that event, and he turned out to be incredibly gracious and charming, and hearing the book read turned out to be a beautiful experience, and the questions went on and on, and the book has the feel when you start reading it of being a memoir. It has he uses I, he uses the first person in describing it, and the person comes back to the United States to live in the Bay Area, which is where he lived, and there are just enormous numbers of similarities, as you'll often have in a first novel. And one of the people in the audience, it's so easy to think of this as a memoir. I remember one of the people in the audience said, well, it must have been terrible to have your mother die when you were in childbirth. And that's what the character in the book is. And Colin said, I just talked to my mother 45 minutes ago. So one is warned never to make any assumption that a book is memoir when it is not. Meanwhile, after this event, I can only assume that Dorothy got to work, because what the title of this book kept cropping up in various discussions of next year's human rights thing, and it was, and boy, that's great, because as a bookseller, it means you'll get to sell a lot of books, and it means you'll get to sell a lot of books that you like. And so I called up Cindy Spiegel again, and I said, Cindy, you know that book, The Kite Runner, that didn't sell very well in hardback? I want you to change your opinion of it. I want you to think of it as a book, as a bestseller. And she said, "Why is that?" And I explained to her about the human rights everybody reads thing that we have here, and what a huge deal it had been for Bel Canto and for all the other books. And within 10 minutes, I got a phone call from the publicist at Penguin. I immediately called Dorothy, and Dorothy just took the ball and ran. I mean, she is. I hope you are all suitably grateful for her incredible work in getting this thing together. She got a huge haul for him to come, you know, a second time, which authors seldom come to a place like Iowa City a second time. And then I got another call from Cindy, and she said, you know, this book is starting to be a big deal. And I said, well, didn't I tell you this was going to be a big deal? And she said, no, you told me it was. but never mind. It was, so now it says national bestseller across the top. And I do believe that this book was a national bestseller, probably in San Francisco, where
it's on New York Times list.
Yeah.
It's on the paperback list. It's like number 8 or something.
Yeah, but it was nothing in the hardback. It did not catch, and when this first came out, I believe that we were one of the very first places to enjoy this book, and I think it makes you feel kind of good. It makes you feel like we discovered something before the rest of the country discovered something. And again, I just feel grateful to Dorothy for her fine work.
Well, I want to add something. I want to thank Paul. He's very like awesome as I do. Paul will grab you and say, I have something you must read. And he took me over to this book, and that's how I discovered it. And I have a lot of must-read books in my house, thanks to Paul.
You're a great customer, Dorothy.
Well, I was one of the people in the audience, thanks to having been drafted by Paul's unquenchable enthusiasm. You must come, it's short notice. When the dishes stand and you rush up into Prairie Lights. And the guy was delightful, and it was a very interesting novel to listen to, and stylistically very polished, etc. But it wasn't until a year later when Dorothy called up and mobilized us for the annual roundup of the books that I actually read The Kite Runner. And I voted for the book with against many other possible titles and many other possible candidates for the following reason, and this is about the extent of what I have to say on its behalf, which is that it seems to me that the book provides us with something less than being about human rights pure and simple in some kind of a predictable way. It provides us with something that it gives us access to an aspect of world culture that we really seldom have otherwise. It's a book that provides us with access to the concept of honor. Today, in the current political discourses, when you hear Americans talk about what is most important in the world, the word freedom keeps coming up over and over again. Everybody keeps constantly alluding to the idea that what America owes the world is to provide the idea of freedom, intellectual freedom, etc., etc. Or as we have heard in recent debates, this is everybody's birthright, everybody must have freedom. And yet it seems to me, as somebody who comes from another part of the world, that there are in fact at least two other paradigms that were of values that people consider as highly as freedom in other parts of the world. In fact, they're sort of competing paradigms. This is not my idea, it's probably borrowed from some stray NPR thing that you listen to. You don't have to to anyone. But it struck me then as a brilliant idea, and I'd like to pass it on. Whoever the anthropologist was says the world is basically divided into places where the highest value is freedom, such as in the West. Then there are parts of the world where the highest value is order, which is valued much more highly than freedom is. And then there are other parts of the world where honor trumps both freedom and order. And so you have a world divided into parts of the world, into sections that don't really share any of it, a fundamental value at all. To try to go to Afghanistan, to try to advance the case for either order or freedom is not going to get you anywhere. To go to Europe and try to advance the case for freedom is going to get you a certain distance, but at some point people will say order is more important to us than freedom is, because order protects the weak. And in the United States or in certain parts of the Western world, freedom is the value that trumps all the other values. So it's like scissors, paper, and stone. You can only have one at a time, but you cannot have all three at once. And this is something that we very seldom take time to think about. We take it for granted, and this is what we call ideology. We take it for granted that our value, namely the value of freedom, is the one that everybody wants to adhere to and everybody wants to line up behind. And as long as we provide them with the coordinates for freedom, they will immediately grasp it, seize on it, and run with it. But when you look at Iraq today, I don't think that people are looking for freedom. I think people are looking for either order or possibly honor. Possibly the people who are fighting in Iraq might be two groups fighting for either order or honor. And freedom, I think, is number 3 on many, many people's list. And so what I liked about this book was that it, in a very modest and a kind of a controlled way, rather than, it's not a tribal narrative. It's clearly spoken from the perspective of a guy in Fremont. It's in turn written by a doctor who knows very well what other kinds of values there are in life than honor. And yet, it really, at the heart of the narrator's persona, is the problem of honor. It's the problem of having been a coward once in his life and having somehow figured out a way how to reconstruct his name, how to reconstitute, how to regain courage, and how to reconstruct his honor. That is really the organizing principle. And it's an American tale, so he doesn't go back and kind of commit blood feud and just kind of exterminate the people who took away his honor. He does it in a much more let's say liberal or tolerable way for us, which is that he redefines the idea of his name and his tribe is not just whatever the character's main name is, Amir, Jan, and not just as his ethnic group, but rather as the honor of a whole Afghani society, so that at the end we have the inclusion of a Hazari kid into what it means to be part of a tribe. Yet the notion of honor is really what is at the heart of the narrative and at the heart of the character. And this a character who has to go through the moment when he pays for his sins, pays for his cowardice by being reduced to a bloody pulp, almost dying, and then reconstruct himself, doing a good deed in turn, and regaining his good name and regaining his father's good name, or sort of making up for his father's lapses. And I think it just seemed to me that this was an important perspective and one that might help us to understand other, parts of the globe in which people think that freedom of choice or human rights or perhaps even order are not necessarily the values that we would most put on top of our list. So,
what is it about a culture that makes it a culture valuing honor or a culture valuing order?
Well, I think in a simple way, it has to do with the proportion that individual is attributed to an individual vis-a-vis a group, right? So we have societies that are much more group-oriented, and I think societies that are honor-bound are societies that tend to overvalue group at all expenses over the individual. I mean, an individual's value is an honor. I mean, by an
Japan. Or would that be?
Perhaps, right?
Maybe.
Order, again, I think organizes the proportion between an individual's right and a group's right in a different kind of a way. It's not, individualism is not valued as highly, the right for self-expression is not valued nearly as highly, and the right for, and the underlying notion is that order is the system that best benefits both the strong and the weak in a society. And I think in this society, we completely disregard the possibility that there would be other ways of structuring the relationship between the individual and the group. We always put a self first, and I think that's one of the reasons why, I mean, religion is obviously kind of a different paradigm, but anyway, so I think I value this for the honor perspective.
Years ago, I taught a course in American novels since 1945, and everybody knew that the unofficial subtitle of the course was books my friend Paul told me to read. Paul didn't tell me to read this book. He didn't invite me to be in that audience because he knows it's not my kind of book. I won't go into that. I'll just offer that. More recently, I've been teaching a Gen Ed Lit course, which probably should be subtitled, literature my friend Heather told me to, and I should say Paul got me in trouble lots of times with his recommendation. But this is the second year in a row that I've taught a book that Heather told me, hey, you ought to teach this book. A lot of people are going to be reading it in the community, and somebody at the university ought to pay some attention to it. So my poor students had it inflicted upon them before I had even seen the cover. Now, the jury's still out on what I think of it as a novel. One of the things that I'd simply say I'll try to represent if there's time today is that, and in many ways this is very trivial, and I need to make it clear, I realize it's very trivial. If we take the big issues, world culture, human rights, honor, ethnicity, if we take all of those things off the table and say, okay, what are you left with here? You're left with some narrative machinery. It's a writer telling a story, and one of the things I've been trying to get my students to look at is how that writer tells the story and what do we think of the narrative machinery. And along that line, I'm also trying to get them to look for problems in the book, parts where the machinery creaks, makes a little too much noise, or where the machinery doesn't seem to be functioning at all. And so some of the problems that I'm now thinking about, and these are narrative problems, these are not value problems with the book, but I try to get my students to understand that in an English department, nothing is better in a book than a problem. I mean, we live to find problems, and if they're not any there, by God, we're going to make some. But I mean, some of the neat problems in this book, you have a narrator who spends a good part of the book trying to convince you what a creep he is. In terms of narrative history, this reminds me a little bit of John Dowell, the narrator of Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. And you have to ask, anytime you have a narrator trying to convince you what a creep he is, what stake does the narrator have in disarming you with that? And if you have a narrator who seems to be confessing all of these weaknesses, what are the weaknesses that he isn't confessing, that he doesn't recognize? And I would submit that our narrator's attitude toward women is something that's probably worth a little bit of thinking about. I would say that our narrator's attitude toward religion is really quite interesting. There's about one page in the book where when Sorab has attempted to commit suicide, when the narrator returns to his religion and is willing to make that deal. Anything it takes to get the kid be okay. And that's the one page on religion. And it occurred to me that the book misses a lot of opportunities to talk about differences in religious values. And along that line, we have the character of Hassan, who is constructed as being incredibly noble in his dedication to Amir. And his father, Ali, is incredibly noble in his dedication to Baba, the father. And so dedication, a mindless dedication, devotion is an incredibly positive value there. But when it comes to talking about the Taliban, and I'm not offering a brief for the Taliban, but I'd point out that some of these folks are pretty dedicated too. They might be dedicated to something worth thinking about. The Taliban is characterized for an American audience, by Asif, who is a Hitler-loving pedophile, and I'm not sure that's the best way to open understanding of a differing point of view. So I'll just mention those are some of the kinds of things that I'm trying to think about in a literary classroom. I value the book tremendously for what it has to say about world culture, about human rights, honor, and ethnicity, but it still is a narrative machine. And one of the things I'm trying to get my students to understand is how that machinery works and when it doesn't work.
I loved this book. And people that know me realize that I say that very frequently, and so they don't take anything I say seriously. But I do love to read, and I did love this book. This book is filled with issues regarding human rights, and I think about human rights almost 18 hours at least a day. And I know I sound kind of boring, but this book is not. Now, I have given everyone a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the preamble and the articles on the rights are depicted in this book in several ways. You will see references to education. You will see references to human dignity. There are all these articles in this universal document that apply to situations in the book. However, what really got to me was that everything that happened in this book, there were universal themes, not just themes relating to a certain culture, okay? It wasn't just the Afghan culture. We had themes that were taking place that could have happened anywhere. They were universal themes. We're talking about bullying, and I'm not saying bowling, I'm saying bullying, B-U-L-L-Y-I-N-G. People frequently think I say bowling. So, Asif was a, pardon?
One of the great human rights issues of
Exactly. I have had 2 programs on bullying, and specifically about what motivates the people that do the bullying and the people that are the victims of bullying. And it's a scary topic, and it's a topic that affects kids and adults in the workplace, in every culture. Okay, and I thought it was quite compelling in this book, as compared to what I do and what I've been doing currently. I think that, as Brooks said, I think there are issues in the book about women that they didn't address. There isn't a lot of references, or there are not a lot of references about women. You get the idea that they died, early on in the book, and then, generally they're not discussed too much after that. And so I think that's an issue. I think that should have been explored just a bit longer. I think that there are issues regarding fathers and sons and communication, and that's a universal theme. It happens in every culture. And the father had some issues regarding the masculinity of his son, because his son loved to read books. Now, you hear that in our culture. If boys were reading books as opposed to playing sports, they get nailed by their fathers on occasion, and that's precisely what happens in this book. So, people think, well, this is about Afghanistan and this culture. I'd say it's about humanity and the world culture, universally. I think Amir's father didn't think real men read poetry. And he didn't stand up for himself, so his father thought he was weak. And so there's a lot of discussion about weakness, masculinity, that sort of thing. And then history repeats itself in the book because, has everyone read the book?
Show of hands.
Yeah, show me those who have not read the book. Okay, I don't want to ruin it for you. Okay, well, let me just say there are similarities and differences, and that's a huge thing to look at when you're considering discrimination and hatred and human rights. You look at the similarities and differences between groups. Now, Hassan and Amir love John Wayne. Okay, the two boys loved John Wayne, and they were friends and doing these sort of boy things where they go and watch John Wayne, and they wear big hats and they go to Magnificent Seven. I love that movie, and they drink Coca-Cola, and they're just regular boys. Okay, but then later on you learn that Amir never has Hassan around when other friends of his come over. So they're not friends in the usual sense, okay? So it becomes more of a servant, owner, slave-like relationship. And so that's where you're looking at the similarities are they both do boy things and you think they're friends, and then the differences are a difference in social standing. So, and then you have the bully, who's a sociopath, and which I think bullies frequently are. However, sometimes bullies are not sociopaths, but they're just bullies because, they grow out of it eventually at times. But some are not lifelong sociopaths. I've met bullies, like when I was a kid, and now they're regular adults, and
Don't keep
they're
gesturing
nice.
in this direction.
No, Brooks was not a bully. He wasn't a bully when I was a kid. He's not a bully now either. Okay, now, the language of violence, the language of discrimination and hate is universal. One of the words Asif called Hassan was fag. That's the key word in our community school district today. Kids, no matter what, are called fags. The skinheads in Germany, they love Hitler. This fellow in this book loved Hitler. So the discrimination and the hate and the hostility, it seems to be universal in its technique. So I thought it was all very fascinating, and I think that those that have not read the book should. There.
Good. Open up for questions from the audience.
Well, before the questions, I have bookmarks listing all the discussion forums, plus information on when the author will be here on November 11th, plus our UICHR, the UI Center for Human Rights website, which will give you discussion questions if you're in a book group, and that sort of information. I am reading the Kite Runner buttons, all free, so if you want to see me afterwards.
Paul, when the author was here, did he ever address the really non-existence of women characters in his book?
I don't believe he did. He was.
Is it just the culture? It's a male culture?
I think it is a male culture. Yeah. He didn't seem like a big macho guy. He didn't give that
He's an MD,
impression. He was an MD, but
He's a gynecologist even.
yeah, he talked. But except that he mentioned that he talked to his mother 15 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago. So it's clear that he didn't say what they'd said, but the relationship was clearly there. But he did not seem to think it was a something that was important to talk about.
I noticed that too, as I was reading it, but in thinking about it and realizing maybe it has something to do with it and maybe not, as a first novel, I was trying to think if the things that I felt were missing had been covered and covered the way I'd like it to be, could it have been of a reasonable length? You know, to add these strands in with the kind of depth and exploration that the other things that are in there, it would have tripled the size of the book.
No, but
So
that's a good point about
I mean,
first novel.
Yeah, I felt that it just also may be speaking to the culture. And I'd have to accept that and say, it's not right, I want another one that speaks to women or other things. But
He
I
chose to
also
write a specific book. He chose to write
It was his
about
book,
him and
you
his
know?
friend,
Exactly,
neither of whom were women.
right.
But I think
Well-
that's the only thing. I think it's clearly it's a society in which children are begotten only to carry on a name. That's the proper trajectory for life, is that you are born to replicate the image of your father, to find approval by your father, and then to move on in along tracks that have been laid out. And in some ways, this is a story about somebody who is dislocated from those tracks for political reasons, for personal reasons first, political reasons second. And the question that the novel opens is, will he reconnect to the father on terms of the Afghani society, which is a traditional, macho, completely male-driven, I mean, it's what in English department used to be referred to in the old days as a homosocial society, where only men count, right? And so, how do you humiliate a man is by treating him like a woman, hence the intercourse, right? That's the chief attack on a man is by sexual rape, by treating him as though he was a woman. So I think the bias against women is fun at the heart of the book, and that's what makes it so interesting. Because, you know, usually people to whom we talk in the kind of a reasonable and pleasant voice don't stand up and say, well, actually, I basically don't share some of your fundamental values, such as, you know, equality between genders. People usually don't say that, but here you have a kind of a psychological profile of a completely decent human being who nonetheless operates. You know, he loves his wife, he would have loved his mother, he loves his mother-in-law, blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is that they are not quite equal players in his book. And I think that's really important to see.
He
You know,
loves his wife and keeps basically the one dark secret, his innermost secret from her for 15 years.
Well, I start off by...
When Soraya unburdens herself of her, I mean, first of all, gratuitously, isn't it convenient that she has something dark in her past that she can apologize for? I mean, kind of gratuitous, it seems to me. But when she does apologize for it, our narrator doesn't attempt to understand. He doesn't attempt to try to place himself in the position of a young girl who would run away with an Afghani doper in Virginia or whatever. What he does immediately is to take her unburdening it and personalize it and say, well, okay, big deal. She got rid of her secret. I'm still stuck with mine. You know? And I thought that was a little bit odd, because Soraya is portrayed so uniformly positive, except for, you know, this mistake in her past, and then that mistake is completely taken over by Amir, who basically says, well, okay, you know, she got rid of her secret, and for 15 years doesn't share with her. I mean, in terms of relationship between husbands and wives, that's not healthy, it seems.
Well, it is not healthy if you believe that parity is the model. But the interesting thing about the book is that it says, well, you know, there are huge numbers of people in the world, perfectly viable, perfectly pleasant, perfectly charming people who just don't think that way. You know, who just don't value that, who just don't think this is a priority. And that's, you know, we never deal with them. You know, we never talk to them.
I don't think the dad and Amir had a very healthy relationship. I mean,
Nobody has any healthy, you know, it's not about healthy relationships.
Who has a healthy relationship?
That's right.
But that's right, it's not meant to be, it's not a morally uplifting book that way. It's a morally uplifting book inside of cultural paradigm.
And remember, we're talking about you're our narrator and not our author, which you've always got to keep separate because.
It gets a little confused because it is our narrator who doesn't share his secret, but it is our author who had her run away with the Afghani man when she was a young girl. So I mean,
Right.
I wonder about both of them, Paul.
Hi, book club discussion that we had about this book, we spent 5 or 10 minutes going over the title, and we all agreed that Hassan was the kite runner, but I was wondering what your opinion is on this, what this symbolizes. Does it symbolize power and control, like several of us thought that, and then the other side of the room thought it symbolized fate? So I just wondered what the panel might think about that.
I'm a little question guy, a specifics guy, you know. I want to talk about how they get the ground glass on the string.
I don't know.
You don't have an opinion?
I don't have an opinion. I seldom think much about the titles of books unless they're really weird titles, and I hadn't really thought much about
Well,
about this one.
title, but the kite runner person, or the
Oh, the
kite runner
notion of the
concept,
kite runner.
What is that symbolizing?
one of the
It can't be
things
as
that-
simple as just an activity.
Yeah, I've read a review, I think, that tries to take this to the geopolitical, that says, well, okay, kite flying, Afghanistan has been a kite that has been buffeted by the winds of international storms. But I mean, in narrative terms, it is, of course, setting up for that kind of perfect reversal at the end, where the kite flyer becomes the kite runner, where Amir becomes the kite runner for Sohrab. And it did occur to me that if you were looking for a kind of a cultural metaphor that would be difficult for an American audience to think about, I mean, you know, during the first part of the book, when Hassan is the great kite runner, and all of his genius actually adds to Amir's status, you know, I think for most American readers, we're reading it and we're thinking, well, you know, like this guy's playing offensive line or something, you know, he's not a quarterback. But it does, in terms of thinking of the kite as fate or something, I can't make that leap when I read a novel. I mean, you know, it's a kite. I ask my students if any of them had ever in their lives been part of a kite fight. No one had, but I actually have. I mean, I think it's a generational thing. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you know, just as a narrative device, it sets up one of the about 5 different moments that you could look at as being a climax. I mean, Hosseini really wanted to end this book with a lot of different climactic moments. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's the final one, and it's the one that comes closest to wrapping things up because it suggests there is a symmetry and a justice in life. And it's the closest thing to saying, well, here's a happy ending that you're going to get in the book.
But it is, you're right. I've always assumed that kite flying is a one-person activity, and this is the first time it occurs to me, or rather, you know, somebody breaks the news to me that in fact you can do this differently. And so it is that, you know, that everybody knows, you know, kites and spring and hope and, you know, spirituality and goes upward and all that, all of these things that are sort of a simple symbol from in one culture, but which now suddenly can have this interesting ancillary technique, which in fact has to do with, you know, severing, cutting. I'm not going psychology.
And I mean, it's kind of rubbing your face in it, you know. Not only did I cut the string of your kite, I'm going to take the kite too.
Well, yeah, I'm going to go get it. Yeah.
Now there's this line in here. It says, but mostly because as the trees froze and the ice sheathed the roads, the chill between Baba and me thawed a little. And the reason for that was the kites. Baba and I lived in the same house, but in different spheres of existence. Kites were the one paper-thin slice of intersection between those spheres. So, you know, they're using that.
Well, gee, anyone quote the book. No, that's a
well,
wonderful,
that was, yeah,
that's
I
the
thought,
definitive answer. I mean, Heather just nailed it. She went to the passage.
yeah,
that we couldn't
here it
find.
is. Like this says it. And so, anyway.
God, you didn't even have that underlined.
I
You
know,
just
I
went
know.
straight
You found it.
Well, it's because I thought of it last night. I was reading along. I thought, that's right. Excuse me.
Yes.
I think I would have liked to have been given more information about the religious differences between Hassan and Amir. That, is it just a tribal thing, or does that affect the way they relate to each other? How entwined are religion and cultural differences between the two?
I think they're related because he makes a point of saying that Amir is a Pashtun Sunni Muslim and that Hassan was a Shia Muslim. But then he didn't go on to explain the difference, and so that was disappointing because, I mean,
Right. Does Hassan stand back and let these things happen to him because of his religion, or is it a class thing?
yeah, you kind of got the impression that was
Or is it
part
a
of
personal,
anyway.
a Freudian thing?
And I thought more that this is the ethnic, this is the food chain, right? I mean, the Pashtuns on top, and then the Hazars underneath, and that's how the society is organized. And these are the rules that are taken for granted, and everybody in Fremont thinks so as well.
And they're both Muslims.
Yeah, but it's an ethnic. So in other words, it's an ethnic division. It's not a religious division, and the religious plays a secondary role. And in fact, religion only comes up when when God is called upon to perform the task that's needed. Which is to save him. I mean, this is the deal with this. The Supreme Father. I will cut you the deal if you let me be a father. If you let this child live, I will let you be my father. So it's a kind of a different family that's reconstructing. I think that the religion is very, in fact, Madaliev, who should have been here today from Uzbekistan, had spoken earlier about this book in another context. And he himself is a communist gone Sufi, so he has a kind of a peculiar take on Islam these days. But he was complaining about the kind of instrumental use of religion in the character, and he was saying this is not a religious book, this is a book that uses religion to be a kind of a conversion narrative. And that's, you might say that's, religion only comes in at the moment when all other ethnic values are disintegrating. Afghanistan is no longer, so what do we have? What is the larger community in which we will all be together, where Hazars and Pashtuns can work together, and where one kind of Afghani exile, another kind of Afghani exile can be together. Maybe even women, by the way, fitting there. So it's a kind of a new Republic of God that he reconstructs. But it's a nation-building book in a kind of a religious. It's a religious nation that he rebuilds, a kind of a paradise on earth where people can fly kites. And so I think that religion there is not really meant to be it's not meant to be a serious investigation of Islam. I think it's a way of creating a world in which other people can be included except for yourself if you give up power over yourself. So.
What about the father's kind of bare bones theology that
Atheism.
stealing is the
Atheism,
only
Well, that's what it looks like to me.
Have you heard anyone talk about whether that fits in with Islam in any particular way? I mean, we know the father doesn't like the mullahs and doesn't respect their teaching. But I was just,
no, he's very secular. He's secular.
He's a secular.
Yeah.
He's
And I think
completely-
that's the end of an era where you could be an Afghani and be a secular Afghani. And now we have a world in which Afghanistan only exists. I mean, from the beginning, that's the end of the world is when the father, it's the end of the secular Afghanistan, and it's the beginning of some kind of a different Afghanistan, which is robed or clothed in this veil of religion. So again, I think it's a book that really, marks the trajectory of what it means to have gone from a modernist Afghanistan to a traditionalist Afghanistan. A nice Afghanistan because it includes the Hazars, but it's nonetheless a religious,
But it doesn't treat women well.
No,
Yeah.
no, well, that's the
Yeah.
yes, that's the point. Yeah.
The father's theology, that sort of bothered me because when I read it, because I thought, he was keeping from his son the affection and the communication that he needed to engage in with his son. And so by his theory, that would be theft. And so he violated his own religious sort of rule. And it bothered me. I get all worked up about these sort of things. So, you see. So.
He treated Ali more like a colleague the father of
Yeah.
Hassan. You know,
Yeah.
he was treated him as more of an equal than he treated his own son, or as more of a because he would sit and at the end of the day be men together
Yes, yes.
with the father of the other what's the son
Hassan.
of Hassan.
But I think Ali knew all the way through the book what his station was.
Well, when the shit hit the fan, he wasn't going to be able to go to California.
Did y'all
Yeah.
notice that there was a little thrown-in line that Ali had memorized the Koran?
Yeah. I
Did
do
it
remember.
say that in here? One?
Little throwaway line, but
Really?
I have another question. Sorry. I was born at the end of our World War II. So I really don't know about the German occupation or anything. But when I read about what Baba did in the truck when they were crossing the border, I thought that heroism is really, it was hard for me to believe, but did the resistance really do that during our life in WW2? I mean, was his character really believable when he would do very heroic things, honorable things? Was that? I thought that was a bit, I wanted to say much, but
So you're asking if Baba's character was over the top, and whether it was it reasonable, or could it be expected from the way the book is written
yeah,
that he
from
would have
his generation.
defended that person
Yeah.
on the truck?
Well, he was, he was respected deeply by his fellow Afghans. You know, he was someone who they felt were, everybody looked up to him, which would indicate that he would be a stand-up guy.
That lady next to you said, in the way he was an end of an era, I find it hard to believe that that person exists or ever existed.
Well, I think to say that it's an idealized father would be an understatement. Yes, I think that he is clearly a kind of a dream father, and he is. We start with the storyteller already being in a position where he looks back over his childhood and says, "Where did it all go wrong?" And so the father is in some ways, you look back over the kind of Edenic or idealized moment of your childhood, and then everything else that follows is the taking down, the descent from that. So I think you're right that he is clearly a larger-than-life character. But then the narrative tells us that he was a larger-than-life character because he had all of these values that the society valued without at the same time being, beholden to God in any way. I mean, that's his great strength, that he's a secularist and yet this completely macho guy, this guy who just, has it all. So he is, I think, larger than life, and he delivers on it, and that's one of the scenes where he really does deliver on it, and where he says, what's important is to stand up for the poor, to take care of the ones that are vulnerable, and that's how you get honor in the society. So I think it's as it were, structurally in keeping with character, but it produces a character that's enormous. Yeah.
And oddly shaped, yes.
Another question in the back.
On the issue of believability, another discussion we had was how believable was it, the part of the book where Amir is moved by his friend, he runs into this long-lost friend and is convinced to return to his country so that he can be forgiven. Seemed kind of manipulative maybe. Was that something that was believable? Would he do that and just be true to his character to leave his wife and return? Thought it might have been kind of manipulated to get the story to go back.
Except in the beginning, he did say that he loved that fellow and wanted him to be the dad. sometimes. I think you feel so guilty.
Loyalty was established early on.
Yeah.
So that was supposed to make us,
And as
Yeah,
Natasha
I
had been,
suppose.
anybody
Yeah.
would do that.
Yeah.
Natasha had been talking also about the notion of an honor society, in which honor was simply more important than anything else.
Comfort, loyalty, any reasonable
You've
behavior.
dishonored yourself. You must do something about
That's
it.
who you are. You don't exist as a human being unless you make up for the lapse in your system of honor.
So it was a cultural decision.
Well, I think that's how that is the world in which the character operates. That's the mental world from which he draws his strength. And in that sense, I think it's not necessarily psychological realism that the book delivers, or it's not psychological realism as we would see it, but psychological realism as a person who really has their mind or their head organized differently would have it. So again, I think I think that's so the parts when you hear the machine being clunky. I take that to be simply a different structure of what one considers
a
a self to be.
lot of the clunk comes around the Rahim character because he writes letters, and it's like the neon light flashes on and off. Here's a letter. There's going to be some heavy language in here, or he makes a phone call. Here's a phone call. There's going to be a heavy message in here. So that is one of the areas. I think Rahim is the
voice of the past. Makes a claim on it.
Who calls, yeah.
Of the voice of the tribe that says, if you want to be an Afghan, if you want to be one of us still, if you want to have any contact with your past life, you've got to go through the following 10, you've got to do the following things. So,